Howdy. Good morning, everybody. Let me know if everything's good on the audio. Yeah, well done. We didn't start the fire. Billy Joel. Been one of my favorite songs ever since I was in eighth grade. Um, it's been my goal to go through as much as much as we can on that song throughout this year. There's some stuff that we've obviously not been able to talk about or haven't talked about yet, but really cool song. And of course, then The Office made it a completely different meme, so I appreciate that too. Hello, everybody. I am glad to see you in the chat already. I know there are a few more people who are probably making their way in. That's totally fine. So we'll be getting started in just a minute. Our lesson today is final lesson for this unit, Unit 15. So this is lesson 7 called the Nixon years. So we're going to be talking, all about Nixon's presidency and the events that happened throughout that period. And as you'll see, there are several major ones. Hopefully you've already heard of a few of them. We'll talk about those in detail, watch some videos, and that's what we're going to be going over today. This might be a little longer than what we've done over the past few days. I have a lot in here. We'll see. Sometimes I might misestimate how long we are going to be going for today. We might go for a little bit longer than what or a little bit shorter than what I thought longer, but we'll see. A lot of people saying here. I appreciate that, you guys. Good to see you. So homework for today. So I was waiting for a little bit so I could see a little bit more people in here so I could talk about this. Do we have a quiz or something? Yes, we kind of do. Now that test thing, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. Our assignment for today is going to be a little bit longer than our normal 5-question thing. It's going to be a comprehensive unit review, test, quiz, whatever you want to say. It's not the same, obviously, as a test because I can't, come to your house and make sure you're doing everything. So it is open notes. I will say that. It is open notes. That is totally fine. I do not want you to try and search up stuff. I do not want you to try and use Google for it. There are several questions that are specifically going to be designed, so that's not the case. And if for whatever reason I feel like you may be required to do the entire thing over or certain questions over. But it's important that you take your time because this big assessment, this assignment, is 20 questions long. I anticipate it taking about an hour to complete. Now, that's obviously a pretty high estimate. I do expect most of you will be under that time, but I would, if I were you and you were about to work on this, I would set an hour aside, so you are able to complete it in that entire time. You don't have to go back to it. You are allowed to use your notes because I know some stuff has been a while ago, and it's hard to keep everything straight, especially with the way everything's going. This is lesson 7, so thank you for helping me out with that in the chat. But yeah, lesson 7. Make sure you are getting this done and getting everything getting that turned in. It is due tomorrow since we're not supposed to be working Friday through Monday because of Easter weekend. So make sure you are getting that done today or tomorrow if at all possible. It will go live at 11:30. Normally I schedule everything to go live at 11. So if you're on here, you can kind of get that done while I continue talking. But today, since this is number 1, this is going to go a little longer. And number 2, it's an assignment which deserves, your full attention on it. It will be going live a little bit later. If you have issues with it, you're having problems, let me know. I should be able to help you out. But again, that's something you need to get done. I anticipate a lot of people are going to rush through this. So if you are, watching now live or on broadcast, just make sure you're hearing what I'm saying. Take your time. Put the effort forth the first time so you don't have to take the entire thing again. If it really looks to me like you weren't putting any effort forth at all and you're just rushing through, you may have an entirely different assessment for you to be doing, because there's a lot of questions I cut out, a lot of questions I could add in from Pearson stuff like that. I don't. It's gonna look similar to your old test because I kind of modeled it after that. I added plenty of different questions, took out different ones. But take your time, read carefully, use your notes, and you'll do just fine. All right. Moving on with our lesson for today, which is the Nixon years. Richard Nixon's actually an interesting figure throughout this entire unit. We've been able to mention him. As I said, what time am I going to post the assignment? That's going to be live at 11:30. So shortly after I go off, or if this goes long, then at 11:30, and we might be on here. You can get on there and take a look at that. Remember, please ask me questions because I don't want you to be confused about anything that's going on your assignment. Ask questions. I'll be able to at least point you in the right direction. And as a reminder, these are obviously all saved either on YouTube or on Twitch, so you can go back and watch these. All right. So Richard Nixon, interesting person throughout this entire period of history. He's somebody that you can actually talk about in just about every single lesson that we've gone over throughout this entire unit, because in 1952, he became vice president underneath Dwight Eisenhower. He ran for president again in 1960 and against JFK. And then finally, now we're going to take a look at when he becomes president himself. He was a pretty popular figure and very, very well known throughout the United States because he's been in the media for a very long time. He had taken trips to the USSR and spoken on the same stage as Khrushchev and gone back and forth with him. He's a prolific figure, and we're going to see how he was able to secure the presidency. So in 1968, you had President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had the potential option to continue to serve as president. Now, he had already served for 6 years, which sounds like, okay, well, isn't that the max? You can't go for more than 8. Well, technically that's true, but with since he became president after JFK was assassinated, he didn't serve. He served only. He served less than half of that term as president, so therefore he was allowed to serve in for another 4 years if he chose. However, he decided he didn't really want to do that. Number one, he was not the most popular guy at the end of his run, probably because of Vietnam and some of those issues that had caused, as well as just a little bit of divisiveness still going on throughout the nation. So his popularity plummeted, and he decided he didn't want to run for another term. So they want to get a few new people in there, and the favorite for the Democratic nominee was actually Robert Kennedy, RFK. So that is John F. Kennedy's brother. He was expected by many people to get that nomination and be a pretty good chance to have a pretty good chance at winning the presidency. Obviously, JFK was very popular before he was assassinated, and sometimes dying early, dying young, being assassinated can kind of build up the positive thoughts towards that person. So there was actually a decent chance that Robert Kennedy was going to be able to ride that to a potential presidency himself. However, that never came to be because Kennedy was actually assassinated just a few years after his brother by a Palestinian who opposed Kennedy's support for Israel. He was in Los Angeles when he was shot and died the next day. The assassin's name was Saran, and he is currently, right now, still serving a lifetime prison sentence in San Diego, I believe, which also means that Saran, and yes, that's his name. He has this, first and last. It's his real name, but it makes him the first person that we've mentioned in this history unit that is still alive today, which is interesting trivia fact there. Instead, you had Hubert Humphrey winning the nomination for the Democrats, going up against Richard Nixon, who was a nationally prominent figure and a pretty popular guy. George Wallace also enters the race as a third-party candidate, securing that victory for Nixon. Because the thing is, you can see that map over there. You could tell that Nixon was able to win pretty easily, pretty securely. And that, yes, there are some big-time states, New York and Texas and Pennsylvania, which all went to the Democrats. But for the most part, Nixon was able to secure much of the country. And what that doesn't show is that how close it really was. He barely won the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College easily because George Wallace was able to take away some of those votes potentially from Humphrey. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean all of those would have gone to Humphrey if he had chosen to, not run, but it certainly secured Nixon's victory. We'll take a look right here. The popular vote was incredibly close, being less than or being about 500,000 difference there, and that's obviously a big number, but in terms of elections, that's awfully close. And you can see how George Wallace was almost able to get 10 million votes himself. In the electoral vote, Richard Nixon's able to get 56%, even though he only received 43% of the popular vote. And you can see in many key states down here, I know my head's blocking a little bit, but George Wallace had a pretty significant part in many of these that could have potentially swung some of these states over to Humphrey. Now, California was pretty secure in Nixon, but things like potentially, who knows? Illinois perhaps could have swung over. You could go on and take a look at those, but ends up being a very close race. But Nixon does come out on top. And Nixon was very much against a lot of what President Johnson had put forth. We talked about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs, all these efforts that he put forth to kind of counteract poverty and do a lot of good for the general public in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, relief for homeless, stuff like that. Instead, Richard Nixon wanted to start cutting those in order to return power to the states. That's something that the United States has certainly gone away from as we've gotten closer and closer to modern day. Originally, you've talked about this before, how states had a lot more individual power to decide how they wanted to run and different laws. More and more as we get closer to today, you'll see that that's not as much the case. A lot of big overarching laws get handled at the national level, and we kind of just have to adopt that or potentially, face different consequences. But he wanted to return power to the states in what he called new federalism. And he claimed that he wanted to help what he called the silent majority. By this, silent majority sounds like is a weird sounding term, but what it basically means is Americans who were disturbed by the unrest of the 1960s but did not protest publicly. Those people who aren't always going to go out and make themselves known, put their opinions out so the public, takes attention, but are silently kind of wanting everything to go in a certain direction. If that term sounds familiar, that's because it's actually been a term that was used by President Trump and some people who were trying to analyze why he was able to win a surprising victory in 2016. And they said it was the silent majority because it was those people who don't always make their political views out there and heard on platforms like social media, going out to the streets and, taking those actions, but they all thought a certain way that maybe it was not the most popular view in the media's perspective, but they actually had united together. They actually had a pretty, they had a majority, if you will, on the rest of the country and how they thought. Now, obviously, in terms of 2016, the people who voted for Trump did not win the popular election, but they were able to secure the election in many states that were not expected to go his way. So it's kind of that similar idea. Nixon was not necessarily expected to be the winner, but he was able to win because there were so many groups of people who did actually agree with a lot of what he was saying. They just were not the most vocal about it. And Nixon begins his law and order program throughout this time. Federal funds are used to help local police departments. Conservative judges are named to the Supreme Court. A lot of laws are beginning to be enforced a lot stricter than before, especially in terms of things like drug use and stuff like that. Not necessarily the biggest, the crimes that everybody knows are always going to be, you're going to get in trouble for theft and violence and stuff, but smaller stuff, kind of cracking down on just general unrest in a lot of major cities was something he wanted to focus on. And you can see throughout his time, the economy begins to struggle. You could see in 1968, inflation begins to go up and up and up. Now, we've talked about before how you generally want to have some amount of inflation from year to year. If you dip below, like in Truman's time, we've talked about that, how that could be bad. You just want to have a steady amount of inflation hovering, around 2% or so. That's natural. But when it gets out of hand like this, that becomes a whole nother issue. So yeah, some economic problems start to pop up. It's not a serious issue yet. The public has not turned on and soured on Nixon just yet. It's something that's playing in the background just a bit. All right, so we said we were going to talk a little bit more about the space race. I'd love to get into. I mean, I know that we have a lot of people who love to really get into this, and I wish I could get in even more, but we got to continue. We got to continue on because our book just skims over this. But I wanted to take a little bit of time outside the book to talk about some of this. So throughout most of the 1950s and 60s, the USSR competed to be the first to achieve specific scientific landmarks in what is known as the space race. So there were a few different big landmarks that they were all trying to be the first to achieve. Obviously, launching a satellite into space. They wanted to put a man in space, and they wanted to eventually land on the surface of the moon. So they're competing to show who is the true premier scientific country in the world. Who has the best scientists? Who has the best mind? Who is the best country to lead the world into the future? And the USSR actually takes the first big step forward by launching Sputnik, the first ever man-made satellite into space to orbit the Earth for a bit. And they were the first ones to achieve that monumentous achievement. And that kind of woke up a lot of people in the United States. And they, as they looked around, they're like, okay, how can they do this before we were capable of doing it? I thought the United States was supposed to be the best country in the world in terms of science and achievements. It's just a few years ago, we were the first ones who had developed the atomic bomb. How could we fall behind? Well, obviously, the country's leadership didn't like having have that put on them. They didn't like having that reputation of how could we not keep up. So they started to pump more and more money in and build up, NASA and our own and build our own fleet of engineers to compete directly. Of course, then USSR also then sends the first ever human into space, Yuri Gagarin, who travels just for a bit in space before returning back to Earth. United States continues to now pump a whole bunch of money in. Missions are launched regularly. And we eventually sent John Glenn into space as becoming the first American to go into space. And then eventually in 1969, after years and years of missions and some failures and successes, and eventually they were able to achieve the greatest triumph, the greatest victory throughout this space race by landing on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. It's one of the greatest victories in the Cold War era at all. And it's kind of an interesting way to think about, war, considering there's absolutely nothing militaristic about a lot of these missions. But it truly was one of the biggest victories in the Cold War as they were able to achieve this huge thing. And many people were able to tune into the news as this was public that they were going to be going and launching this dangerous mission. And then, obviously, the United States was able to celebrate this achievement. And the first word spoken on the surface of the moon: it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. by Neil Armstrong. Also on the moon with Neil Armstrong was Buzz Aldrin, and then Michael Collins, who never got to land on the surface of the moon, unfortunately. But Buzz Aldrin is still alive today, so there you go. Neil Armstrong passed away just 8 years ago or so. But they were able to achieve this huge achievement, and this was obviously publicized throughout the world, shouting the greatness and the achievements of the United States and how they were able to secure this first. Also, I want to talk about a little bit about Apollo 13, because that's a very, very interesting story in and of itself. So obviously the Apollo 11 secured the victory, more or less, in the space race, but that doesn't mean that they stopped continuing to launch more and more missions. So Apollo 13 was just a short while later. They were going to send people back up to the moon to collect some more data, and continuing to show that they were able to do this securely. And by this point, astronauts had achieved a certain level of celebrity in the United States. They were viewed as American heroes. They were viewed as extremely brave people who would go to places previously unexplored. And there's a reason why they were considered these brave heroes, because it was a very dangerous thing. There's a lot of potential for failure. There had been rockets that had failed to even launch and exploded and killed the crew immediately. It was far from a secure thing. So when Apollo 13 gets launched, they were actually able to broadcast back to the United States on television multiple times for the American people to just kind of see this small group of astronauts, these three astronauts who had gone on this mission. They could directly talk back and broadcast to the American people, and it united a lot of people in these events. And then, of course, disaster struck as one of the oxygen tanks malfunctioned and basically exploded. And while the main most of the space, sorry, I'm tripping over my words. I need some water. But most of everything was still intact. As they continued on, it was now in grave danger of completely failing. Everybody had survived on board. All three had survived. And that's where you get the famous quote, the Houston, we've had a problem, that I'm sure you've seen just attributed to a lot of different stuff in sports events and all that kind of stuff, all that ever since. But they had to basically, instead of continuing the mission, they had to find a way to launch themselves around the room, and then around the moon, and then make a re-entry into Earth without a lot of the securities that they had originally had. They were failing in terms of overall power. They were not able to keep the capsule completely warm, so they were at almost freezing temperatures throughout the entire thing. It was a very, very difficult, very nerve-wracking for the crew, obviously, and for the American people watching at home. Obviously, this became worldwide news as everybody had turned their attention to, will these astronauts be able to make it back safely? It wasn't just this instant, okay, well, explosion and that's the end. This was, are we going to be able to bring them back, or are they going to be lost in space, or worse, what could possibly happen to this crew of individuals? If you've seen Apollo 13, it's a very, very popular movie, very, very well done. I recommend seeing it. But this became a worldwide event as the people of the United States, people of the USSR, people across the globe tuned in to watch this stuff basically happen live. So one of the biggest issues was, were they going to be able to withstand the extreme heat of re-entering Earth's atmosphere? There was they really thought there was a decent chance that this was not going to work the way they needed it to. So millions of people, but it's estimated that 70 million Americans which obviously was a huge number at the time, tuned into this broadcast to watch will these astronauts be able to return home securely. We're not going to watch all 10 minutes. We're going to just watch the beginning part, but I'll mute myself as we watch this, basically the same broadcast as they did now 50 years ago.
We're now coming to the moment, the last moments of Apollo 13 as it comes in, as it begins its re-entry. The best thing we can do now is just to listen and hope.
The last few seconds down to re-entry. At this point, there's very little anybody can do, including the astronauts, except wait as they come in through the uppermost fringes of the Earth's atmosphere. The computers put them on course. All anybody can do now is cross their fingers.
Apollo Control, Houston, we've just had loss of signal from Honeysuckle.
And they are coming in faster than predicted. They're coming in just about as fast as any spacecraft has returned from space before. The last few seconds now to re-entry, and they've lost them on the main radio contact antenna in Australia at Honeysuckle Creek. Just about now, they should be going through the moment of maximum heat. And we'll only know whether or not that heat shield was damaged by the explosion 3 days ago, when they come out of radio blackout in just over 2 minutes.
Estimate for max G was 5.2 Gs.
About 30 seconds to go to the end of radio blackout.
About
now.
30 seconds to go.
Houston, Texas there.
For blackout. Less than 10 seconds now. We will attempt to contact Apollo 13 through one of the Orion aircraft. Continuing to monitor this Apollo Control, Houston. We've had a report that Orion 4 aircraft has acquisition of signal.
They're through.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over. Okay, we read you, Jack.
You can see there they were able to finally make that connection and the relief on many people, on many of their faces, as they were able to make it through the most difficult part of this. And you can see
They're going in there to drop a flare for the wind direction.
there they are landing.
I think this picture you're seeing must be for the first time.
All right. So it was a moment that the world stopped to watch and see exactly how this would turn out. And not only was it, the United States all watching and hoping, but even the USSR had ships there in the ocean to try and make sure that they were able to secure the astronauts as they returned in, because with that explosion, they didn't know what had, been destroyed on the craft. I mean, they talked about, was the heat shield damaged? Was it going to be possible? Is it possible that they were not even going to be able to make it through the atmosphere? So the world was watching. It's a moment that everybody was able to kind of come together and hope for the safe return of these astronauts. All right. So wrapping up Vietnam, we kind of left off last lesson on this inevitable failure by the United States and South Vietnam. They were not going to be able to secure victory. So in 1969, Nixon actually ordered the bombing of communist bases in Cambodia, as they were still trying to salvage what they could from this war. They didn't want it to be a complete failure. But with no end in sight, Nixon began to turn the war over to South Vietnam and withdrew American troops. They began that process, and as thousands and thousands began to leave, they were basically left to themselves. In 1975, after American troops had withdrawn, Communist forces captured Saigon, which was more or less the capital of South Vietnam, and United Vietnam under Communist government renamed Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City, and showed that they had lost. Cambodia was actually also taken over in the same year by the Communist Khmer Rouge, this communist group that ended up releasing a reign of terror on the Cambodian people underneath Pol Pot. You could go into that a whole bunch. I'm just going to briefly skip over that because it's something that you're going to talk about later, probably next year. Hundreds of thousands of people fled Cambodia and Vietnam to settle in the United States, and actually Houston's one of those cities that you can see that has been directly affected by this. We have one of the largest populations of Vietnamese people in the world, and it's actually one of the largest demographics in the city of Houston. Vietnam ended up, though, leaving Americans wondering how far the nation would go just to fight communism, as this had been a failure. They were unable to stop communism in Vietnam, and then perhaps based on either their actions or just the domino effect the domino theory actually coming into effect somewhat, Cambodia had now fallen underneath communist rule. So it was playing out, but it kind of ended up more or less stopping there, not spreading to places like Japan, where they were really, really worried that it would. Nixon, on a different note, Nixon wanted to try and make reparations or repair relations, really, not reparation, but repair relations between United States and some other of the big foreign powers in the world, specifically China and the USSR. For years, the United States had refused to recognize Mao Zedong's communist government in China, instead recognizing the nationalists in Taiwan as the true government of China. It wasn't until about 79, where they started to recognize the communist rule that had been going on as the actual leadership of China. But Nixon was still trying to change the relationship by visiting China in 1972 in an attempt to repair relations with the Chinese leadership. Sit down and have formal discussions, talk about restarting trade and avoiding any sort of international conflict. This was a interesting move because it was pretty much unprecedented for a president to travel that kind of distance to some of these countries and visit these locations where much of the American public was worried about, was starkly against. But he thought it was more important to establish peace talks and make sure that there was going to be no issues between the nations. He also, that same exact year, became the first U.S. president since the start of the Cold War to visit the Soviet Union. Nixon all this was an attempt to reduce tensions between superpowers and a policy known as détente. That's that word right here. We'll get there in a second. Détente. Just an attempt to reduce the possibility of war, especially with the nuclear potential of these countries. USSR and the United States established more trade, and they also agreed to limit each other to the amount of nuclear warheads that they could have, and they weren't just constantly producing more and more and having this threat of going to war. They decided to limit how much they would continue to produce and secure a more hopefully a lasting peace between the two nations. I know there's a lot on this page, so I'll wait for publicly. Yeah, exactly. It's always a matter of how much can we get away with, and how much is really publicly known to both countries on terms of how much, how many nuclear warheads we have, what truly they are capable of. So it certainly just created a better public image, and overall, though, it de-escalated what could have been a disastrous worldwide conflict. And as we know, to this day, we still haven't managed to go to war with either country. So you could say at least it perhaps worked. Perhaps. That doesn't mean tensions are completely gone. Obviously, to this day, there's tension between United States and China and United States and Russia. But yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead unless somebody says otherwise. We still have a decent bit to get through. All right. The election of 1972. So think back to what we just talked about with the with détente, with the Apollo missions. There was a strong sense of American pride by 1972. Nixon had done several things that the United States people were very happy with. First of all, withdrawing many troops from Vietnam. Obviously, the public opinion of the war had shifted pretty far south. They did not. There was not a complete support for that war continuing. You had the victories in the space race, and you had this public diplomacy of reaching out and trying to make peace with other countries. So Nixon ends up all of this makes him a very, very popular president. And the Democratic nominee running against him is George McGovern. And of course, this election ends up becoming one of the more famous events of all time, because on June 17th, 1972, police caught 5 men breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters and the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. Obviously sparking a controversy unlike the United States had hardly ever seen before. It appeared that the burglars were there to steal information about the Democratic strategies, to wiretap phones, to secure as much information as they could. But Nixon assured the public that nobody in the White House was involved in the break-in, that it was done by somebody else completely apart from him, and he had no knowledge of it beforehand. And these words were well received by the public, and Nixon ends up winning the election in a landslide. Of course, as we know now, what he was saying was not exactly the case. The Watergate scandal didn't exactly go away. There's more and more information continuing to be discovered that, and as it turns out, the public learns that Nixon had actually paid the spies, or supposedly paid the spies, and is what he tried to say. Can I go back? Yes, I can. All right, I'll just talk about Watergate for a second. The Watergate was like a series of buildings in a district near Washington, D.C. There's a hotel, apartments, office buildings, all this different stuff. That was just the name of the set of buildings, and it became obviously the key phrase for this whole scandal. And ever since then, for whatever reason, American public has taken that suffix of "gate" to mean some sort of scandal, which is very confusing, doesn't make a lot of logical sense, but that's just the way that we do it now. If you're a fan of sports, you think back to Deflategate, which is just such a weird name and doesn't make any sense at all. But that's where that comes from. I mean, Watergate wasn't a scandal about water, so whatever. It's just a personal thing that I take exception with, but whatever. Anyway, American public learns that Nixon paid spies to keep quiet about his involvement and enlisted the CIA actually to help obstruct the investigation. And more information continues to get released to the public, and all throughout, Nixon's popularity, of course, plummets as it looks like more and more information becomes public that, yeah, you know what, he actually was probably involved with this, which, when you think about now in retrospect, that's kind of crazy. Look at that election map. I mean, it's pretty secure that Nixon was going to win, and yet they took these actions to, try and steal this information. It makes you think, okay, well, what illegal activities have been going on for years past prior for people who didn't win? What's going on? Why was this thought to be necessary? But either way, Senate hearings revealed that Nixon had actually made secret tapes of recordings of conversations in his office that could potentially show with absolute definitive evidence his guilt in this situation, but he refused to turn them over. And of course, in something completely separate from the Watergate scandal, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew was accused of taking bribes and evading taxes and was forced to resign. So throughout this entire investigation, another scandal comes up. Nixon then appoints Gerald Ford to be his vice president. As the investigations continued, he ends up giving up his tapes because he is ordered by the Supreme Court, and a House of Representatives committee passes an articles of impeachment against Nixon, including one of the charges being obstruction of justice, trying to put those efforts forth to prevent the truth from being made known public, or just to the courts or to like the Supreme Court or whoever's doing the investigating in this situation. And of course, one of Nixon's probably Nixon's most famous speech to this day comes in the middle of this whole investigation. It's a quick one, but I'll let you take a look at that.
And I want to say this to the television.
Oop, I messed up that.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Gage. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Raven. Anyway, as I was saying, those words go on to haunt Nixon throughout the rest of his presidency, as more and more information is made public. More and more information is made known, and it's clear that he was directly involved. He had he had known about this break-in and what information was trying to be taken. He ends up handing over the tapes that prove that he is guilty after ordered by the Supreme Court. It does take him still about a month to do so, but he turns them in. And as the impeachment trial he is eventually, as we said, impeached by or set to be impeached by the Senate. The House sends those papers over, just like what happened, not too long ago with Trump. He got to that stage, but instead of going through the whole Senate hearing and then hearing that verdict Nixon instead decides to resign before he could be fully impeached, and would have been found almost certainly guilty and removed from our office. He resigns instead, so he doesn't have to go through that, and Gerald Ford becomes president. And obviously, Ford's put into a tough decision. You had many people who were still on Nixon's side. Who were still on Nixon's side, and didn't want to see, and didn't appreciate everything that had gone through. They were still on the Republican side. They didn't want to switch off of that just because of this. And Ford wanted to maintain that support. This economy was struggling and was just continuing to getting worse because of all of this, and he needed to help the American people move on. So he decided to give Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon from whatever crimes he may or may not have committed. So that would be ended, and Nixon wouldn't have to face the possibility of potentially going to prison or something, which was a very real possibility. Ford hoped this pardon would put the scandal to rest and keep the nation from continued disunity. Obviously, it looked terrible for the United States. What had just been a great public image a few years prior with the space missions and Apollo 11, Apollo 13, getting them back safely, had just completely flipped the other direction, as now the rest of the world is watching America implode on itself with this presidential level scandal. So he hoped that this would end it, that this would be the end of the whole Watergate scandal, and the country could move on. And in some ways they did. They continued to move on, but this made Ford extremely unpopular, as many people wanted to see justice, and rightfully so. Other people thought this was a decent move, but it's what Ford decided he had to do to help the United States out and continuing to move forward. But it made him a very unpopular president, and not one that held the office for very long. All right. I think that is it for this unit. Yeah, that's where we're going to leave off for today. I know it's about almost 11:20, so I might just post go on there and post the assignment a little early so you can get working on that as soon as you'd like. Again, you know how long the tests take you, or most of you do. I know obviously we have some new students, but I would estimate this taking you an hour. So I would continue. I would set aside an hour for when you can work on this completely. Make sure your notes are ready and all caught up. If for whatever reason you didn't get some of these written down, go back, take a look, get those finished, so you are ready to go. Yeah. Are there any other questions before we move on, or do you want me to make this open so you guys can take a look at this and make sure we can access, if you guys are willing to work on this right now? I'm going to go ahead and just make it public. Boom. It is available for you guys to take a look at. If you're on YouTube, I'm going to end the broadcast here, so let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me a comment on either on Google Chat, on Chat, or on Classroom. I'll try and respond to it as quickly as I can. Otherwise, it's the end for Unit 15. We're going to be moving on to Unit 16. Not next week, but the week after. Next week, we're going to be working on something different.